Hello and welcome to this story. In the pages ahead, you are going to explore one of the most fascinating and controversial business sagas of the 21st century, the rise of Huawei, the Chinese technology giant that grew from a small local company into a global powerhouse, only to find itself at the center of some of the world's biggest political and economic tensions. This is not just a story about smartphones, 5G networks, or corporate success. It's a story about innovation meeting geopolitics, about how technology can no longer be separated from global power struggles, and about how one company has come to symbolize both the promise and the risks of the digital age. Here's what you can expect in this journey. We'll begin with the origins of Huawei, how it started in Shenzhen in the 1980s, and how its founder, Ren Zhengfei, built a company against the odds. We'll explore Huawei's rise in the telecom world, how it became a leading supplier of networking equipment and later, one of the top smartphone brands in the world. We'll look at Huawei's innovations, from 5G networks to AI and cloud technologies, and why they became so disruptive. We'll dive into the controversies, including accusations of espionage, intellectual property theft, and its clashes with the United States government. We'll explore the geopolitical battles that put Huawei at the heart of the US-China rivalry. And finally, we'll reflect on what Huawei's story tells us about the future of technology, globalization, and power. This will not be a dry business case study. Instead, you'll read a narrative, almost like a documentary in words, where each chapter pulls you deeper into the drama of Huawei's rise and struggle. By the end, you'll understand not only how Huawei became a global tech leader, but also why its very success triggered some of the biggest political storms of our time. So, let's begin the story of Huawei, Tech and Tension, the story between innovation and geopolitics. The story of Huawei begins not in a glittering skyscraper or a shiny tech campus, but in a small, struggling electronics company in Shenzhen, China, in the late 1980s. To understand Huawei's DNA, you must first understand its founder, Ren Zhengfei. Ren Zhengfei, the soldier who became an entrepreneur. Ren was not the typical Silicon Valley-style founder. Born in 1944 in a poor province of China, he grew up during turbulent times, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and the slow modernization of China. His early life was marked by scarcity and hardship. He joined the People's Liberation Army, PLA, as an engineer, not as a soldier on the battlefield. His work was focused on infrastructure and technology, helping to design and construct communication systems for the Chinese military. This experience shaped his mindset, discipline, persistence, and a belief that technology was a tool of power and survival. When China began to reform its economy in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Ren left the military and entered the business world. But unlike Western entrepreneurs, he had no venture capital, no connections in Silicon Valley, and no government plan to make him rich. Instead, he started with just a few $1,000s and a vision to help modernize China's communications systems. The birth of Huawei. In 1987, in Shenzhen, a small fishing village rapidly transforming into China's first special economic zone, Ren founded Huawei with just 5 employees. The company's name, Huawei, is often translated as China's achievement, or Splendid Act for China. The symbolism was clear. This was not just about profit. It was about contributing to China's modernization. At the beginning, Huawei didn't invent its own products. It started by reselling telephone switches imported from Hong Kong. But Ren was never satisfied with being a middleman. He believed China needed its own technology, not just foreign imports. Slowly, Huawei began to reverse engineer and then design its own telecom equipment. Survival against the odds. The early days were brutal. China's market was flooded with competitors, including state-owned giants with far more resources. Huawei was a small private company in a country where private enterprise was still viewed with suspicion. Ren had to convince local officials, customers, and employees that Huawei could be trusted. He adopted a strategy of hard work and sacrifice. Huawei employees often lived in the same dormitories, worked long hours, and reinvested almost all profits back into research and development. Ren himself was famous for his strict discipline and for instilling a military-like culture inside the company. The seeds of global ambition. By the early 1990s, Huawei had developed its first digital switches and was beginning to compete with larger Chinese rivals. But Ren was thinking bigger. He knew that the future of telecommunications wasn't just in China, it was global. He also understood something few in China realized at the time: the West was not going to hand over its technology leadership. If Huawei wanted to succeed, it had to innovate relentlessly and fight its way into markets that didn't trust Chinese products yet. Thus, from its very first years, Huawei's story was not only about technology. It was about survival, discipline, and ambition, values that would carry it from a small Shenzhen office to the world stage. In the early 1990s, China was experiencing a massive transformation. Cities were growing, factories were multiplying, and millions of people were moving from the countryside into urban areas. With this rapid growth came an urgent need for modern telecommunications. Landlines were scarce, networks were outdated, and the country was far behind the West. For Huawei, this was both an opportunity and a challenge. Riding the wave of China's growth, the Chinese government began pouring resources into expanding the nation's telecom infrastructure. State-owned operators like China Telecom were tasked with building networks that could connect hundreds of millions of people. But there was a catch. Most of the equipment had to be imported from foreign companies such as Alcatel, Ericsson, and Siemens. Huawei could not compete with these giants on brand recognition, financial strength, or technology, at least not yet. But Ren Zhengfei saw a niche. While Western firms were focused on big, wealthy cities like Beijing and Shanghai, smaller towns and rural provinces were often ignored. Huawei targeted these markets aggressively, offering cheaper equipment and better customer support. A culture of relentless effort. Huawei's employees, still living and working in near-military conditions, began installing switches and building networks in some of the toughest and most remote regions of China. In places where foreign engineers didn't want to go, Huawei went. In mountains, deserts, and rural villages, the company earned a reputation for reliability and persistence. Ren Zhengfei promoted the idea of wolf culture inside Huawei, a mentality of being aggressive, resilient, and always hungry. This attitude, though controversial, helped Huawei grow while competitors underestimated it. From reseller to innovator. By the mid-1990s, Huawei was no longer just reselling or copying foreign products. The company was investing heavily in research and development, R&D. Ren committed to reinvesting at least 10% of revenues into R&D every year, an unusually high figure, especially for a Chinese private company at the time. Huawei opened its first research center in Shenzhen and began developing its own digital telephone switches. These weren't groundbreaking yet, but they showed that Huawei could build original technology. Gradually, Huawei earned contracts not only in rural China but also in larger cities, chipping away at the dominance of foreign companies. First steps abroad. While Huawei was busy conquering the Chinese market, Ren was already thinking beyond China's borders. In 1996, Huawei made its first move outside the country by signing a deal to supply telecom equipment to Hong Kong. Soon after, the company started exporting to developing countries like Russia and South America, where Western firms had less interest. This was a crucial strategic move. Instead of competing head-on with Ericsson or Nokia in rich countries, Huawei built its reputation in emerging markets, where price and adaptability mattered more than brand recognition at home. By the end of the 1990s, Huawei was no longer a small player. It had become one of China's leading telecom equipment providers, with revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Even the government, which had once been suspicious of private companies, began to see Huawei as a strategic national champion. Huawei's rise during this decade was not glamorous. It was built on hardship, discipline, and long nights in forgotten corners of China. But it laid the foundation for what was to come: Huawei's transformation into one of the most powerful technology companies in the world. By the early 2000s, Huawei had become a dominant force in China's telecom industry. It had proven it could outwork, outmaneuver, and sometimes even out-innovate foreign competitors on its home turf. But Ren Jingfei knew that if Huawei wanted to be truly great, it couldn't just stay inside China. The next chapter of Huawei's story was about going global, and it would not be easy. The leap abroad. In 2000, Huawei opened its first research center outside China in Bangalore, India. This was a bold move. India had a large pool of talented engineers, and Huawei could use this base to develop software and services more efficiently. Around the same time, Huawei began winning contracts in markets where Western firms weren't paying much attention: Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. For example, in 1998 Huawei entered Africa by building networks in Kenya. By offering low prices, flexible financing, and strong technical support, Huawei quickly became the partner of choice for developing countries hungry for connectivity. This strategy of focusing on the global south gave Huawei an international foothold while avoiding direct confrontation with giants like Nokia, Ericsson, and Cisco in Europe and the United States. The European challenge. Huawei didn't want to remain a developing world brand forever. To prove itself, it had to break into the advanced markets of Europe. In 2003, Huawei signed a landmark deal with BT, British Telecom, to supply equipment for its broadband network. This was a breakthrough. A major European telecom operator was trusting a Chinese company to provide critical infrastructure. Soon, Huawei was opening offices in London, Paris, Berlin, and other European capitals. The company invested heavily in R&D centers across Europe, hiring local engineers to reduce concerns that it was just a cheap Chinese copycat. Still, skepticism remained. Western rivals accused Huawei of unfairly benefiting from Chinese government subsidies. Some governments worried about national security risks, given Huawei's possible ties to Beijing. But Huawei kept pushing forward, emphasizing its commitment to quality and innovation, competing with the giants. At this time, the global telecom industry was dominated by Nokia, Finland, Ericsson, Sweden, Alcatel, France, Lucent, USA, and Cisco, USA. These were established giants with decades of experience. Huawei's main advantage was its cost-performance ratio. It could deliver technology that was nearly as good, or sometimes even better, at a fraction of the price. This made Huawei extremely attractive to telecom operators who were under pressure to cut costs. By the mid-2000s, Huawei had secured contracts with global carriers like Vodafone, Orange, and T-Mobile. Suddenly, it was no longer just a low-cost alternative. It was a serious global competitor. Building a global workforce. Huawei's expansion also required a new kind of workforce. The company began hiring thousands of employees outside China. By 2008, more than half of its staff were working abroad. But Huawei kept its unique culture, long hours, high discipline, and what Ren called the wolf spirit. This sometimes clashed with Western work-life balance norms. Yet many operators appreciated Huawei's determination and speed, recognition and resistance. By the late 2000s, Huawei was recognized as one of the top 3 telecom equipment providers in the world, alongside Nokia and Ericsson. The company had officially made it into the global elite. But success also brought resistance. Governments and competitors began asking hard questions. Was Huawei truly independent, or was it too close to the Chinese state? Could a company that grew so quickly be trusted with critical national infrastructure? These questions would become louder in the years to come. But for now, Huawei was riding high, transforming from a Chinese challenger into a global powerhouse. By the late 2000s, Huawei was already a global player in telecom infrastructure. But the next technological revolution was brewing: the rise of smartphones. Apple had released the iPhone in 2007, and within a few years it completely redefined what a mobile phone could be. Samsung followed with its Android-powered Galaxy line, creating a global duopoly. Nokia and BlackBerry, once leaders, were collapsing. For Huawei, this was a moment of decision: should it stay focused on telecom equipment, or should it jump into the brutally competitive consumer market? Ren Jingfei and his team decided to take the gamble. From networks to pockets. Huawei was already making basic mobile phones for carriers like Vodafone and China Mobile. But these were low-end devices, often branded under the carrier's name, not Huawei's. In 2009, Huawei officially entered the smartphone market. Its first Android phone, the U8220, was launched in partnership with T-Mobile. It wasn't revolutionary, but it signaled Huawei's new ambition to compete not just in the back-end networks but in the hands of everyday consumers, competing with Apple and Samsung. At first, few people took Huawei seriously. The global smartphone market was brutally competitive, dominated by companies with massive marketing budgets and strong brand loyalty. Huawei's strategy was to move step by step. Start with affordable smartphones for emerging markets. Build partnerships with carriers around the world. Gradually move into the mid-range and premium segments. By 2012, Huawei had released the Ascend series, which gained attention for offering good performance at lower prices than Apple or Samsung. A new consumer brand. To succeed globally, Huawei needed to transform its image. For years, it was seen as a network equipment provider, not a cool consumer brand. So Huawei invested heavily in branding and marketing. It sponsored sports teams, partnered with celebrities, and even ran flashy ads on billboards in New York and London. The company's goal was to make Huawei a household name. This was a long road, but Huawei was determined. The Breakthrough P series and Mate series. In 2014, Huawei made its big breakthrough with the P series and Mate series smartphones. These devices combined sleek design with strong performance. Most importantly, Huawei partnered with Leica, the legendary German camera company, to co-engineer its smartphone cameras. This move gave Huawei instant credibility in a critical area, mobile photography. The results were impressive. Huawei phones began topping global camera rankings, often beating Apple and Samsung. Suddenly, Huawei was no longer just a budget brand, it was a serious innovator, rising through the ranks. By 2016, Huawei had become the third largest smartphone maker in the world, behind only Apple and Samsung. In some markets, like Europe and Asia, Huawei phones were outselling iPhones. The company was proving that it could do the impossible, compete with the world's most powerful consumer electronics brands. But with success came new challenges. Huawei's growing presence in Western markets drew more scrutiny from governments, especially in the United States. The suspicion that had long surrounded Huawei's telecom business now extended to its consumer devices. Still, for Huawei's leadership, the gamble had paid off. The company had transformed itself from a quiet telecom supplier into a global smartphone powerhouse. By the mid-2010s, Huawei was no longer simply a Chinese telecom equipment maker trying to catch up with global leaders. It had become one of the strongest innovators in the industry, and its next battlefield was the most important technological race of the decade, 5G. 5G promised to revolutionize the way the world connected. Faster speeds, lower latency, the ability to connect billions of devices, from autonomous cars to smart factories. Whoever controlled 5G would not just dominate telecom, but shape the future digital economy. Huawei recognized this earlier than most. The company poured billions into research and development, hiring tens of thousands of engineers and opening research centers across Europe and Asia. Its goal was clear: to be first in 5G. The strategy paid off. By 2018, Huawei held more 5G patents than any other company. Its equipment was often cheaper and more advanced than competitors like Ericsson and Nokia. In many countries, mobile operators chose Huawei for their 5G rollouts because of the combination of performance and price. This success gave Huawei enormous influence. Suddenly, it was the backbone of critical digital infrastructure in dozens of nations. But with this success came a storm of political tension. The United States accused Huawei of being too close to the Chinese government, warning allies that using Huawei's 5G equipment could pose a national security threat. Washington lobbied European countries, Australia, and others to ban or restrict Huawei's involvement in their 5G networks. Huawei repeatedly denied the accusations, insisting it was independent and that its only goal was technological progress. Yet the geopolitical pressure was undeniable. Meanwhile, inside Huawei the focus was relentless. Engineers were working on innovations not just in telecom equipment, but also in artificial intelligence and chip design. The company launched its own processor line, the Kirin chips, developed by its subsidiary HiSilicon. This vertical integration gave Huawei more control over performance and reduced dependence on foreign suppliers. For a moment, Huawei seemed unstoppable. It was a leader in telecom infrastructure, rising fast in the smartphone market, and becoming a symbol of Chinese technological ambition. At tech expos in Barcelona, Berlin, and Shanghai, Huawei's booths drew crowds as large as apples. The company was no longer an imitator, it was setting global standards. Yet the higher Huawei climbed, the stronger the headwinds became. The tension between innovation and politics was reaching a boiling point. Huawei had become not just a business competitor but a pawn in the great geopolitical struggle between China and the United States. The story of 5G was no longer only about technology, it was about power. The turning point in Huawei's story came with the United States launching an unprecedented crackdown. By 2018 and 2019, Washington had moved beyond warnings and into direct action. Huawei was placed on the U.S. Entity List, which meant American companies were forbidden to sell key components and software to Huawei without special government approval. This decision struck at the heart of Huawei's global business. One of the hardest blows was the loss of Google's Android license. Until then, Huawei's smartphones were powered by the full Android ecosystem: Gmail, YouTube, Google Maps, and above all, the Play Store. Suddenly, new Huawei phones were barred from shipping with these services. For consumers outside China, where Google apps are essential, Huawei phones became far less attractive. Sales in Europe plummeted. Another critical hit was in semiconductors. Huawei's HiSilicon division had designed powerful chips, but it still depended on manufacturing by foreign foundries like TSMC in Taiwan, which used American technology. Under U.S. restrictions, those foundries could no longer supply Huawei. Overnight, the company's cutting-edge smartphone business was at risk of collapse. Washington justified these measures by claiming Huawei could be a tool of Chinese state surveillance, though no public evidence was ever provided. For U.S. policymakers, it was not just about Huawei, but about containing China's technological rise. Allowing Huawei to dominate global 5G networks was seen as giving Beijing a backdoor into the world's digital nervous system. Huawei fought back. It launched its own operating system, Harmony OS, to replace Android. It accelerated efforts to build a self-reliant supply chain inside China, investing in domestic chip manufacturing, cloud services, and AI. At press conferences, Huawei executives accused the U.S. of bullying and said the company was being punished simply for being successful. But the damage was undeniable. Huawei's smartphone sales, once second only to Samsung, fell sharply. The company that had dreamed of overtaking Apple in global handset dominance was suddenly struggling to keep its consumer division alive. In Europe and other Western markets, telecom operators faced pressure to exclude Huawei from 5G rollouts. In some countries, existing Huawei equipment was even ordered to be ripped out and replaced. Yet inside China, Huawei became a symbol of resilience. Consumers rallied around the brand, buying Huawei phones as an act of patriotism. State media portrayed the company as a national champion unfairly attacked by the West. Despite shrinking abroad, Huawei grew stronger at home, turning its challenges into fuel for domestic pride. The crackdown did not destroy Huawei, but it forced the company into a new phase of its existence. It could no longer count on global openness or seamless integration with Western technology. Huawei would need to reinvent itself, finding strength in isolation, and building a new path under the shadow of geopolitical rivalry. If the U.S. crackdown was designed to cripple Huawei, it instead triggered one of the most ambitious reinvention stories in modern corporate history. Cut off from its key suppliers, stripped of access to American technology, and shunned by many Western governments, Huawei faced a stark choice: accept decline or transform. The company chose the latter. At the center of this transformation was Harmony OS, Huawei's in-house operating system. What began as a backup plan suddenly became a strategic centerpiece. HarmonyOS was designed not just for phones, but for a broader ecosystem: tablets, wearables, smart TVs, and even cars. Huawei envisioned a future where its devices formed a seamless digital environment, independent of Google or Apple. While critics initially dismissed HarmonyOS as just another Android fork, Huawei steadily refined it, building a loyal user base in China and preparing for a gradual international rollout. Equally important was Huawei's pivot toward enterprise and infrastructure. While the consumer smartphone division shrank under pressure, Huawei doubled down on its network equipment, cloud services, and AI research. It launched Huawei Cloud, competing with Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Alibaba Cloud. In sectors like smart cities, digital health, and education, Huawei presented itself as an innovator ready to help governments and companies embrace digital transformation. The company also poured billions into semiconductor research, aiming to build a homegrown alternative to foreign suppliers. Although China lagged behind in chip-making equipment and advanced lithography, Huawei worked with domestic partners to push the industry forward. This was part of a larger national effort. The Chinese government prioritized technological self-sufficiency, making Huawei both a beneficiary and a driver of Beijing's industrial policy. Despite sanctions, Huawei engineers continued to astonish the world with breakthroughs. In 2020, it unveiled a 5nm Kirin processor for its flagship phones, designed in-house, though supply constraints meant it could not be mass-produced for long. Later, whispers emerged of Huawei developing new chips with only Chinese technology, a feat many thought impossible under restrictions. Culturally, the company adopted a mindset of survival. Ren Zhengfei, Huawei's legendary founder, urged employees to prepare for a protracted battle, and compared the company's struggle to a wartime siege. Yet he also insisted that adversity would make Huawei stronger. This narrative resonated deeply with employees and the Chinese public, who began to see Huawei as a national symbol of perseverance. In international markets, Huawei adjusted its strategy. While excluded from many Western countries, it found eager partners in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. There, Huawei's combination of affordability, reliability, and financing options made it an attractive choice for governments and telecom operators. It was in these regions that Huawei's 5G networks continued to expand, despite Western objections. Reinvention was not just about technology, it was about identity. Huawei could no longer be just another global tech brand. It had to embrace its role as both a pioneer and a political flashpoint. To survive, it would need to innovate under pressure, expand in friendlier markets, and turn limitations into opportunities. What once looked like a crisis was slowly turning into a new chapter. Huawei, reshaped by adversity, was evolving from a global smartphone giant into a diversified, resilient powerhouse, one no longer defined solely by consumer devices, but by a broader vision of the digital future. By the early 2020s, Huawei had become more than just a company. It was a mirror reflecting China's broader technological ambitions and the world's anxieties about them. For Beijing, Huawei embodied the dream of escaping dependence on Western technology, of creating a self-sustaining innovation ecosystem that could rival Silicon Valley. For Washington and its allies, however, Huawei symbolized the risks of allowing a geopolitical competitor to dominate the digital arteries of the future. Domestically, Huawei enjoyed near-legendary status. Its struggles under American sanctions were portrayed in Chinese media as proof of foreign bullying, and Huawei's survival as a triumph of national resilience. Consumers rallied around the brand, buying its phones even when they lacked popular Western apps. The company became a symbol of patriotism, with "Made in China" shifting from a label of low-cost goods to one of high-tech pride. In the international arena, Huawei's role was more complex. In Africa, Latin America, and parts of the Middle East, Huawei was celebrated as a provider of affordable infrastructure that allowed developing nations to leapfrog into the digital age. In these regions, Huawei's 4G and 5G networks connected hundreds of millions of people, powering mobile banking, online education, and e-commerce. For many governments, Huawei was less about geopolitics and more about opportunity, the chance to modernize quickly and cheaply. Yet in Europe, Australia, Japan, and North America, Huawei was increasingly treated as a pariah. Politicians warned of hidden backdoors in its equipment that could be exploited by Chinese intelligence agencies. Even when technical audits found no such evidence, the suspicion persisted. Trust, once lost, was impossible to fully regain. Huawei became entangled in a broader narrative about the U.S. China rivalry, a struggle not only for economic power, but also for control of the world's technological standards. For Huawei itself, this dual identity, hero at home, suspect abroad, was both a burden and an opportunity. On one hand, it limited the company's ability to expand freely into lucrative Western markets. On the other hand, it cemented Huawei's role as the national champion of China's technology sector. Supported by state-backed financing, policy initiatives, and a strong pool of engineers, Huawei turned into the spearhead of Beijing's push for digital sovereignty. The symbolism was not lost on ordinary citizens. When Huawei announced new devices or breakthroughs in chip technology, the news often made national headlines in China. Consumers lined up outside stores not just to buy gadgets, but to support what they saw as a patriotic mission. For many, owning a Huawei device was an act of loyalty, a small but powerful way of declaring independence from foreign dominance. In this sense, Huawei's story became inseparable from China's broader story, a nation rising from being the world's factory to aspiring leader in advanced technology. And just like China itself, Huawei remained caught between admiration and suspicion, innovation and controversy, progress and pushback. Huawei had moved beyond being just a player in the tech industry. It had become a symbol, one that carried the weight of national identity, global rivalry, and the unresolved tensions of a digital world divided by politics. Huawei's journey is not just the story of a technology company. It is the story of how innovation collides with politics, how engineering excellence becomes entangled with questions of trust, and how one firm can embody both hope and fear in a rapidly changing world. From a small importer of telephone switches in the 1980s to a global leader in telecommunications and consumer electronics, Huawei built its empire on relentless research, bold ambition, and the willingness to outcompete even the most established Western rivals. Along the way, it brought the internet to remote villages, made smartphones affordable for millions, and shaped the backbone of modern connectivity. These are achievements that cannot be dismissed, regardless of where one stands in the geopolitical debate. Yet Huawei's rise also revealed the fragility of globalization. In an interconnected economy, where technology flows across borders, the success of one company can trigger anxieties in another part of the world. For the US and its allies, Huawei's dominance in 5G represented not just competition but a potential national security risk. For China, restrictions on Huawei highlighted the vulnerabilities of relying on foreign suppliers for critical components. The result was a global tug-of-war where technology became inseparable from sovereignty. Huawei today stands at a crossroads. On one path lies continued innovation, domestic support, and expansion into emerging markets that welcome its affordable infrastructure. On the other lies isolation from Western nations, sanctions that limit access to cutting-edge chips, and a constant battle against suspicion. The outcome will depend not only on Huawei's technical capabilities but also on how the world chooses to balance cooperation and competition in the digital age. In the end, Huawei is more than a company. It is a symbol of the 21st century's central tension, the struggle to reconcile technological progress with political divides. It shows us that the future of connectivity will not be shaped by engineering alone, but by the trust, values, and rivalries that define our global community. Huawei's story remains unfinished, and in that unfinished story lies the blueprint for the future of technology itself.